Have you ever seen four loudmouthed outlaws test the wrong stranger? Oblivious that his unassuming manner conceals a reputation for unbelievable speed on the draw, in the dusty reaches of Candle Bend, a single stare down in a saloon turns from mockery to a blazing standoff. Elias Caro, boots worn, voice quiet, seems just another tired traveler. But rumors whisper he once put over 30 men in the ground, each foolish enough to challenge him. To find out how an entire town stands up against a corrupt wave of newcomers, and how one silent gunman becomes their unlikely defender, you'll want to hear this story through to the last moment. And if these frontier sagas move your spirit, subscribe to our channel. We have more tales of grit, honor, and the unbreakable will of everyday people that you won't want to miss. A single tumbleweed rolled across the main thoroughfare of Candle Bend, trailing flecks of dry soil that caught the late afternoon sun. The silent watchers perched on the porch of the mercantile barely spared it a glance. Their attention was fixed on a lone rider at the far end of town, guiding his dapple gray mare with the easy grace of a man who'd crossed too many miles to count. No one recognized him, but there was something about how he surveyed the clustered buildings that made folks hush their conversations. The newcomer's name, though not yet uttered, was Elias Caro. Elias dismounted in front of the Painted Feather Saloon, the battered brim of his hat shading eyes so sharp they missed nothing. He pulled a faint cloth from his saddlebag, wiping the day's dust from his face. To passers-by, he was just another traveler stopping for a drink, maybe a place to sleep. But if they'd known the rumors swirling in certain territories about a man with a lightning draw, someone who used to wear a ranger's badge, they might have crossed the street rather than stand in his path. Inside the Painted Feather, the stale scent of whiskey and sweat mingled with the slow, squeaking rhythm of a fan overhead. Helen Boyd, the saloon's proprietor, looked up from polishing a row of cloudy shot glasses. She exchanged a quick glance with the piano player, who nodded toward the door as the stranger stepped in. Elias walked with the faintest limp, an old war souvenir that only revealed itself if you watched closely. His expression hinted at neither joy nor sorrow, just an impenetrable calm that unsettled folks more than any glower ever could. Near the back corner, Garrett Sidewinder Carter and his three cronies nursed whiskey and trouble. They'd been in Candle Bend a mere week, but had already made their presence felt. Subtle threats to local shopkeepers, some missing goods from a stage route, whispers about intimidation at the bank. A final check for who truly ran Candle Bend. Garrett's chain of command included Merrick Deadeye Waller, known for his nerve-wracking accuracy, Jamie Cross, a hothead still seeking to prove himself, and Stanton Rellis, an ex-soldier scarred by too many battlefields. As they played cards, their conversation was loud, peppered with boasts and the promise of easy money. More than a few saloon patrons had called it a night just to avoid crossing paths with them. Elias approached the bar with a measured step, ignoring the side eyes and muttered jokes from the gang's table. He tipped his hat at Helen in greeting. "Whiskey," he said softly, voice just above a whisper, but enough to carry. She nodded, pouring from a bottle better than the usual cheap stuff. If Elias noticed the tension in the room, he gave no sign. Yet Helen, who'd survived 2 decades of running saloons in rough country, spotted it in his posture. The readiness of a man who'd seen more showdowns than Sunday church services. From their corner, Garrett and his men swapped glances. This quiet fellow had the bearing of someone either ready to fold under pressure or stand tall with lethal ability. Jamie Cross cracked his knuckles, an unmistakable challenge shimmering in his youthful eyes. As Elias brought the glass to his lips, the 4 men exchanged smirks that said, "We'll test him soon enough." Afternoon light slanted through the saloon's dusty windows, catching motes adrift in the stagnant air. Helen Boyd subtly angled her head, letting Elias know with a faint nod that trouble might soon head his way. He answered with a barely perceptible lift of his shoulder, an unspoken reassurance that he could handle himself. Outside, a crow cawed from the roof of the blacksmith's workshop, as though warning Candle Bend of an oncoming storm no one wanted to acknowledge. Seated at their battered table, Garrett Sidewinder Carter regaled his companions with a tale of a prior heist. He punctuated each boast with a dramatic slam of his mug, the coarse retelling of stage robberies echoing in the Painted Feather. Merrick Deadeye Waller, cradling a well-polished Colt, regarded the newcomer with measured suspicion. Next to him, Stanton Rellis, battered hat angled low, fingered the faint stubble on his chin, as if weighing his next move. But the one who really had ants in his pants was Jamie Cross, fresh-faced despite the dust of the trail and itching for a chance to prove he was more than a sidekick. "Hey, friend," Jamie called, voice loud enough to hush half the saloon. Elias paused in sipping his whiskey, but didn't turn. "We greet folks here. Ain't polite to ignore, you know." The challenge hung in the air. A faint hush spread through the painted feather. Helen's grip on the cloth stilled, knuckles whitening at the corners. Elias exhaled quietly. He placed his glass on the bar, rotating just enough to acknowledge the table. The flicker of his eyes swept across four-armed men who'd seen their fair share of scuffles. Men who believed their numbers gave them an edge. "Didn't realize you were talking to me," Elias said, voice soft, unhurried. A glimmer of satisfaction touched Jamie's face as if he believed he'd earned the confrontation. "Sure was," he said, with a too-wide grin. "We're a friendly bunch, see? Don't want folks thinking Candlebend is unwelcoming." From the far side, Merrick Waller snorted. "Friendly so long as nobody crosses us," he muttered, just loud enough to imply threat. Stanton Relis, picking at a dented tin mug, let out a low chuckle. The tension in the room felt like a clock, spring coiled to near breaking. Helen Boyd tried to intervene, stepping forward. "We keep the painted feather civil," she reminded them, setting her cloth aside. "No trouble in my saloon, you hear?" Stanton Relis's eyes flicked her way, but he said nothing. The general store clerk, perched at a nearby table with his half-finished ale, began shifting nervously as though planning a silent exit. Garrett Carter, leaning back with false casualness, finally spoke. "Your name, stranger?" Elias considered them for a moment. "Caro," he said simply, letting his gaze drift from Carter's cocky smirk to Waller's cold watchfulness. Jamie Cross tapped restless fingers on the table. Relis stifled a yawn, though his posture said otherwise. A hush fell, each man waiting to see if the next words would light the fuse. "Caro, huh?" Carter repeated, swirling whiskey in his glass. "You plan on passing through, or do you think Candlebend might amuse you a while?" Elias shrugged. "Just riding until I find the right stop." He turned away, reclaiming his seat at the bar as though the conversation had ended. That casual dismissal rankled the men behind him. Jamie's face darkened, while Carter's smile twisted into something sharper. Hungry for a test of authority. Helen saw it all. She'd encountered men like these before. All it'd take was one spark, a single misread gesture or half a second of bravado, and bullets would fill the painted feather's smoky air. And from the look in Elias's calm eyes, the outcome would be as swift as it was final. When Jamie Cross stood, tipping his chair back with a screech, the hush that descended was immediate. He angled his hat forward, a shallow attempt at intimidation. "Look here, Caro," he said, each syllable loaded with challenge. "We don't like quiet men who ignore a polite invitation." Elias glanced at him in the bar mirror. "Didn't strike me as all that polite," he answered, voice calm. Billy Jenkins, a ranch hand seated at a nearby table, sank down as if trying to disappear beneath the battered wood. Jamie's youthful arrogance thrummed like a plucked string. Garrett Carter leaned forward, a dark amusement flickering in his gaze. "Maybe you should show him some real courtesy, Jamie," he drawled, stirring the pot. Stanton Relis cast a side eye as if reading Carter's intention. Meanwhile, Merrick Waller's gaze never left Elias's reflection in the mirror. Outside, the day's heat had begun to relent, evening shadows lengthening across Candlebend's dusty street. The occasional clip-clop of a passing horse or the distant clang from the blacksmith's shop were the only reminders that normal life waited just beyond these walls. Inside the painted feather, tension coiled tighter with each breath. Helen tried again. "That's enough." But her voice, usually so authoritative, faltered before the aura of men leaning on violence to prove themselves. She gave a subtle shift behind the bar, where an older Colt revolver lay hidden for emergencies. This was shaping up to be one. Jamie made his move, just a step, but enough to break the invisible boundary. Elias turned fully now, stool scraping the floor. His duster opened slightly, revealing the well-worn handle of a Colt. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The few townspeople still inside sensed what might come next. "You any good with that iron, old man?" Jamie taunted, eyes flicking to Elias's sidearm. Elias cocked his head, studying the youth before him. "Seen a few showdowns," he admitted softly. "Not proud of it, but I've learned one lesson. Trouble can be avoided if folks walk away while they still can. The simple statement was a loaded warning. The Painted Feathers piano player, who'd been holding a single note quietly all this time, let it fade into silence. Carter, Waller, and Rellis exchanged glances. Each tried to gauge how far they'd push the confrontation if Jamie insisted on a showdown. Finally, Jamie gave an ugly chuckle. "Mister, you're going to find Candlebend has a new order, one that doesn't let strangers walk in and talk big." Helen shut her eyes briefly, bracing herself. She'd known plenty of good men and brutes alike. In her bones, she felt Elias was neither. He was something else. A survivor of many battles, the kind who fires only once he's sure it's necessary, which made the next few seconds all the more critical. A distant rumble of thunder signaled an approaching storm, as though nature itself prepared to back the tension inside the saloon. The Painted Feather had grown still, each occupant caught between fleeing or watching a legend unfold. Outside, the day's last rays slanted across Candlebend, painting storefronts and wagons in molten gold. Dust swirled in the waning sight like tiny spirits dancing before the storm. Jamie Cross rocked on his heels, the beginnings of a nervous sweat forming at his temple. "Old man, you'll regret crossing us," he spat, though the anger in his tone wavered with each breath. Carter and Waller exchanged faint nods, shoulders tensing for potential violence. Stanton Rellis rested a hand on his revolver, the action so casual it might have passed unnoticed by lesser eyes. Elias Caro studied them all with an eerie calm. He didn't posture or issue threats. Instead, he focused on each man's stance, foot placement, tension in the shoulders, the direction they angled their gun belts. This was how one survived in the chaos of war and gunfighter trails. Read the subtle signals, see the shot before it happens. "Kid," Elias said, voice low, "the only regret I'd have is if folks get hurt needlessly." Garrett Carter shifted to face Elias head on. "That's so, then maybe you should apologize right now and make it easy. Show you know who runs Candlebend." His smirk twisted into a grin. "That might just buy you time to ride out." Helen Boyd forced out a brittle laugh, hoping to ease the mood. "I run this saloon last I checked," she said, chin lifted. "And Candlebend's run by its folks, not some pack of bullies fresh off the trail." The unwavering steel in her voice was a testament to all the fights she'd endured over the years to keep her place respectable. Jamie bristled, stepping forward. "Ma'am, if you were wise, you'd—" He never finished the sentence. Elias moved with uncanny swiftness, stepping between Jamie and Helen, his left hand raised in a near-pacifying gesture, while his right hovered near the Colt. "Don't," was all he said. The single syllable held the weight of countless showdowns. The potential for finality hung in the saloon air, thick as smoke. Thunder boomed closer, rattling the walls. Someone outside shouted about the oncoming rain. The presence of a storm intensifying matched the electric tension within. A bead of sweat trickled down Jamie's cheek. Had he been sober, he might have recognized how outmatched they were. But the whiskey in his veins mocked caution. Carter's sly grin slipped a fraction. Even Waller, who'd seen men claim quick draws and fast kills, began to suspect Elias was the real deal. He tapped the edge of his seat, eyes darting toward the door, as if calculating whether escape or confrontation would be the better path. Stanton Rellis, however, hardened his stance. He'd served in a war once. He sensed no bluff in Elias. "Back down," Elias urged, gentler than anyone expected. "You can walk out of here in one piece. Let Candlebend be." The quiet authority in his tone contrasted jarringly with the unwavering readiness in his posture. This was a man who abhorred unnecessary bloodshed, yet was prepared to do whatever the moment demanded. Another thunderclap, another silent second that stretched like a wire about to snap. The uneasy hush in the Painted Feather hovered as though fate itself paused, letting each man reconsider. Jamie's eyes flicked to Carter, seeking approval for the next move. Carter nodded once, a slight, ominous gesture that all but sealed their course. Carter's nod triggered a sudden shift in the saloon's atmosphere, a near physical wave of anticipation that preceded violence. Jamie Cross's mouth twisted into a determined snarl, and his hand dropped toward his holster in one practiced motion. But Elias Caro's reaction was so swift that onlookers would later disagree on the exact sequence. To most watchers, it appeared Elias barely moved, yet the barrel of his Colt appeared aligned with Jamie's chest in a heartbeat. Kid, Elias breathed, voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Don't do it. The looming thunder outside mirrored the crackling tension inside. Even in that hair's breadth moment, with Jamie's gun halfway out, Elias offered him a chance to stand down. But the alcohol and bravado that had carried the youth this far refused to let go. Jamie's revolver cleared leather. Too late. A thunderous report rang out from Elias's Colt, echoing against the wooden walls. The bullet kicked Jamie's gun from his grasp, shattering the weapon and leaving fragments to clatter on the floor. The younger man staggered backward, shock registering before pain. Blood trickled from a graze along his hand. Screams and gasps erupted from the Painted Feathers patrons. Someone overturned a table, toppling a half-finished bottle of whiskey that spilled amber fluid across the floorboards. In the hush that followed, you could hear Jamie's ragged breathing and the pounding hearts of everyone witnessing this display of lethal skill. Stanton Rellis lurched to his feet, hand darting for his own gun, but Elias, still controlling the scene, turned his pistol upon him in a flash. Sit, Elias ordered, the single word holding an edge sharper than any blade. Rellis froze, uncertain whether to gamble his life on a half-second of timing. Reading the unwavering steel in Elias's eyes, he let his hand fall from the grip. Merrick Deadeye Waller, who prided himself on hair-trigger reflexes, weighed the distance to his piece on the table half a foot away. The glance he exchanged with Carter suggested a micro-debate about whether to shoot or yield. But Carter's face, typically full of cunning, now displayed a grim acceptance. His gang had lost the immediate advantage. The question was whether they'd regain it with guile or continue to push. Helen Boyd, behind the bar, exhaled in a mixture of relief and dread. Another shot might have spelled a full-out firefight. She slid her hidden Colt from its nook, holding it low and ready, but praying she wouldn't need to use it. The piano player, wide-eyed, slid off the bench and edged toward the far corner, seeking a vantage point less likely to be riddled with bullets. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of imminent rain, its ominous howls a chorus to the adrenaline-charged hush inside. Step by step, Carter rose, though he didn't reach for his weapon. Instead, he tried to salvage his authority with words. You're making a mistake, he said, voice taut. This is bigger than you or Candle Bend. Powerful folks backing us. Powerful or not, Elias cut in, unwavering, they ain't here with you right now. Your fancy backers won't stop a bullet on your behalf. And trust me, the folks in Candle Bend aren't about to let you waltz in and own the place. Not after seeing what you're capable of. Jamie Cross lay doubled over, nursing his injured hand, confusion etched in his features. He'd boasted about being the fastest gun around. Now a single shot from Elias had disarmed him, almost gently, by skilled design. The blow to his pride, it seemed, was as crippling as the wound on his hand. Lightning flared into the window, illuminating the saloon's interior like a stage set. In that flash, each face told a story. Fear, fury, desperation. The confrontation was far from over. Even with Jamie wounded, Carter, Waller, and Rellis might gamble on a final showdown. The question was, would they accept the chance to withdraw, or would they bet everything on a lethal last stand? The outside storm began in earnest, raindrops hammering the roof of the Painted Feather. Each impact on the tin shingles echoed like a distant drumbeat. Within that downpour, Candlebend's dusty main street turned to mud, the ephemeral dryness of the day washing away. Yet inside the saloon, an even more intense storm brewed among men whose next choices would shape the fate of the entire town. Helen Boyd glanced at Elias, a silent plea in her eyes, resolved this. She'd seen too many drunken brawls escalate, but this was no bar scuffle. This was the pivot point that decided whether Candlebend belonged to outlaws or everyday folk. The tension pressed so heavily on everyone's chest that breathing seemed optional. Garrett Carter stared at Elias's steady gun hand, his bravado warred with caution. He was cunning enough to see that raw aggression wouldn't outmatch skill, so refined it bordered on the supernatural. We got 4 men, Carter said, voice low. What makes you think you can outdraw us all? Elias actually chuckled, a soft, humorless sound. Because I've been outdrawing men since before your youngest was even in the cradle. War taught me a few truths. One of them is that sometimes, to keep peace, you gotta end the fight fast. Another roll of thunder shook the building, a cosmic underscore to the conversation. Waller, still behind the table, bit back a curse. He'd prided himself on a quick draw, but he also recognized a predator's eyes. In that fraction of a second, Elias could probably shoot him twice. Stanton Rellis peered between them all, index finger inching along the edge of the table in agitation. The ex-soldier recognized the aura of lethal calm that marked Elias as no mere wanderer. Jamie Cross, nursing the graze on his hand, looked up at Carter with watery eyes. The kid had lost his illusions in one clean shot. The fierce glow of hero worship in his gaze was gone, replaced by the raw realization that life in an outlaw band wasn't half as glorious as dime novels suggested. Reckon you can kill us all, but then the entire region behind us? They'll come for you, Carter warned. Word spreads. No place in Texas will be safe. Men with deeper pockets, longer arms, you'll run out of bullets eventually. Elias inhaled slowly, willing his voice not to betray the swirl of old memories. What you fail to grasp is that men like me, men who've lost too much, stop caring about how big the threat is. Candlebend's just the latest town bullied by scum in fancy boots and loaded guns. I've seen it 100 times. Never ends well for those scum. He paused, letting the meaning settle. I'd sleep fine under a borrowed roof or open sky, knowing I stood for something real. Outside, the sheriff's star glinted in the gloom as Sheriff Ender Morgan stepped onto the boardwalk, flanked by a pair of deputies. Water streamed off the brim of his hat, but he paid it no mind. Through the saloon's open door, Morgan took in the scene. Carter's men on edge, Elias calm, everyone else cowering. He recognized the standoff's precariousness instantly. Morgan leveled his voice. Gentlemen, let's settle this peacefully. We don't want lead flying all over Candle Bend. Another flash of lightning sizzled, lighting up the shadows, revealing the slightest tremor in Carter's posture. The rain battered relentlessly, the saloon's timbers shuddering under the wind's force. A muscle in Carter's jaw twitched. He flicked his gaze around, a gambler reading the table's odds. With the sheriff behind them, Elias in front, and a town ready to fight for itself, continuing might be suicide. Yet pride rarely yields gracefully. The entire painted feather held its breath for Carter's next word, the final push that might trigger a hail of bullets or a reluctant retreat. Over the thunder's roar, Garrett Carter's knuckles whitened at the gun belt. For an instant, it looked as if he'd commit to violence. The corners of his mouth twitched as he wrestled with the humiliating notion of backing down. But something about Elias's unflinching eyes and the unwavering stance of Candlebend's townsfolk chipped away at his bravado. With a curse that stung his own pride, Carter let his hand fall to his side. The entire saloon felt the release of tension, like a rope suddenly slack. Merrick Waller and Stanton Rellis, seeing their leader stand down, exhaled as though they'd been underwater too long. Jamie Cross, trembling, tried to rise, mindful not to provoke another bullet. In that hush, the hammering rain against the window sounded strangely comforting, a natural lullaby that told them the worst might be over. Helen Boyd breathed for what felt like the first time in minutes. So that's it? She asked, though her voice still quivered. You'll leave Candle Bend in peace? Well, Carter's jaw clenched. You've proven your point, he said through gritted teeth. But this ain't the end. We got powerful allies beyond these dusty streets. This might have been your day, but tomorrow's a different dawn. The threat lingered, though it felt hollowed by the realization that men like Elias Caro stood in Candlebend's corner. Sheriff Ender Morgan stepped inside cautiously, hand on his revolver. Pack up, don't cause more trouble, and we'll let you ride out. But if you do, he left the threat unsaid. Carter and his men exchanged hard looks. Despite the humiliations, survival instincts triumphed. Each knew they were outgunned and outclassed. Dying in a saloon for petty pride wasn't worth it. As Carter's gang gathered themselves, the tension gradually ebbed. Elias still kept an eye on them, though he lowered his weapon. Slowly, conversation resumed around the painted feather. Patrons righted chairs, and the piano player tested a chord or two, as if ensuring he still had all his fingers. Jamie Cross, eyes downcast, cradled his wounded hand. You didn't have to do that, he mumbled, referencing the expertly placed bullet. Could have killed me easy. Elias studied him with a faint flicker of sympathy. Killing's the simplest solution, but it ain't always the right one. Maybe find a better path. Helen came around the bar, that old Colt in her hand, but no longer raised. She offered them a final chance at courtesy. We have a doctor in town if you need him. a line of compassion for men who'd threatened her establishment minutes prior. Pride kept them from accepting. Jamie Cross's injuries didn't appear life-threatening, so they refused help with a hardened dignity, creeping away to nurse their bruised egos and battered illusions. Outside, the wind continued to swirl the falling rain, turning Candlebend's dirt into mush. Sheriff Morgan and his deputies watched, ensuring the outlaws truly saddled up. Carter cast a single backward glance at Elias, a silent vow of future reckoning. Then they vanished into the tempest-lashed darkness. Inside the Painted Feather, relief mingled with an undercurrent of worry. Storms abated, but floods or fresh troubles might follow. Helen turned to Elias, a question in her eyes. Would the town remain safe once the fleeting hush returned? He gave a slight nod. For now, Candlebend had reclaimed its sense of calm. The real question was how long it could hold on to it. Word traveled quickly through Candlebend that night, carried by the howling wind and whispered conversations beneath dripping eaves. Shopkeepers and ranchers alike realized how close the Painted Feather had come to becoming a bloody battleground. Some took stock of rifles stored behind counters. Others thanked whichever higher powers they believed in that Elias Caro had been there. The rain persisted, washing away footprints and wagon tracks, as though rinsing the day's tension from the streets. By the next morning, the clouds broke into a bright, expansive sky. Candlebend emerged glistening under sunlight, mud giving way to a renewed sense of community. Even the battered sign outside the Painted Feather looked more hopeful, cleaned by the downpour. At dawn, Elias rose from the single cot he'd rented in an empty stable stall behind the blacksmith's. The stable boy apologized for the meager lodging, but Elias had smiled, accustomed to far worse during the war. He hadn't slept much, replaying the standoff's details in his mind, ensuring he hadn't missed anything that might return to haunt them. Now, stepping outside, he let the crisp air fill his lungs, drawing a new perspective for the day. Helen Boyd found him by the well, rinsing the night's dust from his hands. She offered a small tin of coffee, steam curling in the morning air. "Reckon Candlebend owes you," she said, eyes reflecting gratitude. "Men like Carter and that crowd, they've threatened us in ways we might not see until later. But you gave us a chance." He accepted the tin with a nod. "I did what had to be done," he replied, sipping the coffee's bitterness. "I'm no saint, Ms. Boyd, just a man who's seen enough bloodshed to recognize trouble early." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the sun creeping higher, illuminating the muddy street and a few battered shutters left from the scuffle. Sheriff Ender Morgan emerged from the jailhouse with an update. "Checked around, Caro. Carter's bunch left at first light, heading south. If we're lucky, they'll keep riding. If not, we'll be seeing them again, or their associates." The lines on Morgan's face, carved by years of upholding the law with limited resources, deepened at the thought. Elias regarded him evenly. "This town has folks worth protecting. If the law's short-handed, I can stick around a while, at least until we're sure they were truly gone." Helen let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "We can pay," she began, but Elias shook his head. "We'll discuss that if it comes to it. For now, you might be short on funds with the bank still unsteady after the recent missing shipments." Morgan cleared his throat, recentering the conversation. "I doubt Carter's men were working alone. We got a bigger problem. Something about certain shipments never arriving in the next county. If Carter was a piece of that puzzle, more might come sniffing around, figuring Candlebend as easy pickings." Helen squared her shoulders with the unyielding posture of someone who refused to let adversity define her. "They'll find we're not so easy." The determination in her voice resonated with Elias. A memory flickered of another small town, years ago, that hadn't survived its own wave of corruption. He'd carry that guilt forever. Taking a final sip of coffee, Elias nodded. "Then let's be sure we're ready. If there's more on the way, better we meet them on our terms. Candlebend deserves that chance. But first we gather facts. Where the shipments went missing, any leads Carter might have left behind." A silent agreement formed among the three. The storm that battered Candlebend might have passed, but new tempests hovered on the horizon. In a frontier world shaped by greed and guns, standing up once often means standing guard for whatever comes next. By mid-morning, townspeople were busy with the tasks of daily life. Some hammered fresh boards over bullet-scarred walls, while others restocked the mercantile shelves with supplies. The Painted Feather had reopened, a testament to resilience, albeit with a few bandaged bullet holes in the walls. Laughter even trickled from the bar as a traveling salesman recounted a comical near miss with a rattlesnake. Yet underlying this revived normalcy was an unspoken awareness that Candleben still walked a razor's edge. Carter and his gang might have withdrawn, but the vague references to powerful allies and deeper conspiracies echoed through morning greetings and hushed mid-street chats. Everyone guessed there was more to come. Sheriff Ender Morgan gathered Helen Boyd, Elias Caro, and a few key figures, like Miles Grizzly Turner, the stable master, and Lucille Fletcher from the general store, around a battered table in a back room of the jail. The place smelled of old parchment, stale coffee, and faint desperation. "We need a plan," Morgan said, voice gruff from long nights of worry. Carter's men were just the forward scouts of something bigger. Helen drummed her fingers on the tabletop, the ring she wore glinting in the lamplight. "We can't just wait around for them to strike again. People have families, businesses. Candleben can't be forced into fear." Miles Turner nodded, arms crossed over a barrel chest. "If we gather enough watchers on each approach to town, we'll have at least a warning, but it won't solve the root problem." Lucille Fletcher laid out some scribbled notes. "I've gotten word about shipments going missing before they even reach Candle Bend. That suggests infiltration at the source. Carter was just a local piece. We're dealing with a bigger network." She paused, exchanging a glance with Elias. "Which is where you might come in, Mr. Caro. Rumor says you used to investigate such networks." Elias exhaled, leaning back in the rickety chair. "I was a ranger once, assigned to flush out corruption tying bank thefts to official offices. Did the job until I realized half my leads got buried by men in power." He traced a calloused thumb along the battered table edge. "But I'll help. If Candleben stands up for itself, it deserves a fair chance at fighting back." Morgan nodded. "You saw Carter's reaction. He name-dropped wealthy backers. We suspect a judge in Redwood Bluff, possibly more." The sheriff's voice wavered, a sign of how big these stakes felt. "If we can find proof of these connections, a bigger chain of law enforcement might weigh in on our side." Elias tapped a finger on Lucille's notes. "Let's start with the basic roots. Stage lines, the bank here, how money flows." Carter was bragging about controlling Candleben to skim from the edges. "Follow that money trail. We might link it to whichever official is pulling the strings." Helen cast a sidelong glance at Elias. "But if we dig too deep, we paint targets on our backs." Carter threatened they'd return with reinforcements. Elias gave a taut smile. "We all have targets already. We might as well see it through. Because if we cave now, Carter or men like him will own Candleben completely." Outside, the sky had cleared, revealing a dazzling morning sun. Inside, the group solidified a plan. Gather intelligence, discreetly contact whichever honest marshals or rangers remained, and prepare Candleben's townsfolk for defense. The hush that followed was heavy with anticipation. They were stepping onto a path that could lead to a final reckoning, but no one flinched. In a frontier world, sometimes the only choices are to stand your ground or see everything you love trampled under the boots of greed. During the weeks that followed, Candleben operated under a tense semblance of routine. The Painted Feather served drinks and hired a fiddler for weekend dances. The blacksmith hammered out horseshoes for ranchers, while the general store traded flour, sugar, and fresh news. But beneath that facade lay a careful vigilance. Watchers posted at each road, armed men ready to mount up at the slightest alarm. Elias Caro took an unobtrusive role, though everyone knew he was the real bulwark behind Candleben's new discipline. He rode the perimeter each dawn, scanning for suspicious tracks or broken brush. He gathered intel from stage drivers and traveling merchants, piecing together how far Carter's rumored support network reached. The puzzle slowly revealed bigger influences: bankers in Redwood Bluff, a judge rumored to accept bribes from unknown benefactors. Candleben was a single stepping stone in a grander plan to control trade routes across multiple counties. Sheriff Ender Morgan, reinvigorated by the unity of his town, accompanied Elias on some patrols. They discovered more than one small clue: a coded letter dropped by a man who bore the same brand as Carter's crew, a mention of Colonel Ashton Blackburn, a name that garnered fearful whispers. If Carter was a cunning lieutenant, Blackburn was rumored to be the general behind an entire web of intimidation. The mere mention of him made some old ranchers spit in disgust, as though the name itself tasted foul. Helen Boyd's saloon, ironically, became a hub for orchestrating the town's defenses. A place once prized for respite and laughter now held quiet strategy sessions after hours. She'd stand behind the bar, arms folded, as Elias or Morgan detailed their scouting findings. The townsfolk, who'd once merely tolerated each other's quirks, now formed a cohesive community, each occupant feeling a stake in Candleben's survival. As word spread that Candleben refused to capitulate, traveling caravans began rerouting in their favor. The Painted Feathers business thrived, ironically, because folks wanted to see the town that turned away bullies without succumbing to them. It was a short-lived boon. In quiet moments, Elias would stand on the boardwalk, scanning the horizon for dust plumes that might herald the arrival of a stronger force. The calm always preceded a storm. The first sign came on a chilly morning as autumn threatened the desert nights. A messenger, half dead from exhaustion, stumbled into Candlebend at sunrise. He delivered a crumpled note to Morgan, brief, cryptic words. Blackbourne rides with 20 men. Fortnight away, prepare. The messenger collapsed into delirium, muttering about unspeakable cruelty in a neighboring county. Sheriff Morgan's face darkened as he read, "We have 2 weeks, maybe less." He handed the note to Elias. "Could be rumor, could be a partial truth, but we can't ignore it." Elias traced the words with a grim acceptance. Blackbourne. Carter mentioned bigger fish. If the mention is accurate, we're not dealing with common outlaws. He's ex-military, rumored to have half a dozen loyal officers turned mercenaries under him. They crush towns that stand in their way, using fear as a weapon. Helen, arms wrapped around herself, suppressed a shiver. Then we stand or fall. We proved once that Candlebend won't be bullied. Let's see if that lesson holds. Her voice shook a bit, but steel underlay the trembling. Miles Turner, standing behind them, added softly, "We can't do this alone. Maybe the Rangers?" Elias considered it. "We'll send word, but Rangers can't always rally in time. Candlebend might have to stand on its own for those crucial hours." He glanced around, meeting determined gazes. "We can do it if we stay united." And so, with the memory of Carter's defeat still fresh, Candlebend prepared for a larger threat. In a land where might often made right, the little town had discovered a deeper might in shared convictions, friendships, and the unwavering aim of one quiet gunman who'd chosen to stand with them. The final test loomed just beyond the horizon, and none knew what shape it might take. Yet in Candlebend, hope flickered like a steadfast lantern against an encroaching night. In the end, Candlebend didn't just survive, it discovered a fiercer heartbeat. Through tense standoffs and harsh lessons, neighbors learned how strong they could be when they stood as one. Elias Caro, a man who once wandered with no fixed star, found his place in the unity of folks who refused to bow to fear. Though storms might gather and outlaws might conspire, Candlebend earned a lasting pride as the town that never surrendered its soul. Some say you can still spot Elias on the porch of the Painted Feather, sipping Helen Boyd's best coffee, calmly scanning the horizon. When shadows move across those desert hills, he simply rests a hand near the worn grip of his Colt and smiles. Maybe it's a reminder that not every fight needs a hero, only everyday people who refuse to break. What part of this story struck you most? Share your thoughts below, and let's talk about how courage can rise from the humblest hearts. And if you want more tales of frontier grit and moral standoffs, subscribe to our channel and follow us for many more good stories to come.